And we're fortunate enough this week to have Dr. Adam Lankford, he's going to introduce himself, so if I screw it up, he'll correct me. He is the department chair for the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Alabama. And it's no secret probably to the guys that are part of my network, that's where I graduated. So I met and spoke with Dr. Lankford, I don't know, a few weeks ago down on campus. Come to find out through general conversations, he is quite a renowned expert on the phenomenon of active shooter scenarios. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Lankford to introduce himself, and if he falls short, he doesn't like to brag. So Dr. Lankford, if you would, share your presence on national media, the MSNBC, and all those shows you've appeared on, if you would. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Brand. It's great to have you as a graduate at the University of Alabama and of our program. So, always happy to connect with alumni. My name is Adam Lankford, as Brand said. I've been here at the University of Alabama, both teaching in criminology and criminal justice and doing research for 15 years now. One of the things I guess that surprised me earlier in my career here was how understudied mass shootings and active shootings were. And a little bit of that changed in 2012 with the Sandy Hook shooting, bringing a lot of attention to the subject. But I guess I've been, just able to capitalize on the timing of this being an understudied subject. So much important research needing to be done, and been kind of one of the leaders in doing new research on a variety of elements of this problem. So I've looked at everything from mass shooters and active shooters psychology, their behavior, their suicidal motives, their use of firearms and other weapons, some of the strategic decisions they make, some of their decisions related to fame seeking and attention seeking, and various elements of countermeasures we use to try to prevent their attacks. And because this is such a traumatizing issue for so many Americans, kind of as a result, a lot of my research has gotten a tremendous amount of attention, both nationally and internationally, both from law enforcement and government, but then also from the media and average members of the population who, frankly, as you can probably appreciate, they may think like, well, I'm not too worried about my wife or my husband killing me because I picked a good person, but I am worried what happens when I go in public and I'm just minding my own business and someone opens fire. The average American can make decisions to avoid being part of a gang or being involved in drug trafficking, but this is one of those types of crimes that seemingly strikes everywhere and can strike anyone.
Yeah, so the national news media that you've been on CNN, you've been on Fox, you've been on MSNBC. You have, what, 2, 3, half a dozen books to your credit and numerous white papers on this subject. Is that all accurate?
Yeah, for the most part, a lot of the other thing is, important for scholars is what's called peer-reviewed journal articles, right? So it's kind of the highest standard for science because you're being evaluated and sometimes challenged by other people who are considered experts. So I have a lot of articles in those types of journals, scientific studies, and yeah, not to toot my own horn, but really every major media outlet in the United States has covered my research. I've done interviews, with all those organizations, and just as a human being, one of the kind of difficult things sometimes you experience is, I'm just going through my life and there's a horrific event. And then all of a sudden I'm getting calls from major media organizations, and they're kind of saying, please, give us more information that can help people understand this incident, along with, foreign media, from something like 40 plus countries.
Yeah, something you mentioned a few minutes ago is the way I think this phenomenon has conditioned all of us to think differently. And true, I graduated from the University of Alabama with a criminal justice degree back in '83. So, and I had been a police officer for a brief period of time before active duty. So I've always had that, I don't know, tickle in the back of your mind. You just look at things differently, but none more so in the last few years with the active shooter scenarios. When I walk into a Starbucks or a Walmart store or anywhere, it may not be top of mind, but I certainly at some point during that visit look around and I'm more aware of my surroundings, be it exit doors. How do I get out of here if something happens? I've never been the guy that likes his back against a wall in a restaurant. I'm one of those weird guys, but now I look at even in Starbucks, sitting in a different place. And, we'll get into the mental health issues and the challenges that are broader beyond legislation, but I think it's conditioned the general population in the United States to look at things differently. Public forums. I was at a Coldplay concert in Maryland at, what is that, FedEx Field, I think it is. It's huge, 80-odd thousand people, going to games at University of Alabama, about the same number, 80, 90,000 people in the stadium. And I think about the complexity of the security and the preparation that has to go into that, but needs to necessarily sometimes remain not invisible, but out of sight of everybody, so it doesn't feel like you're walking into a combat zone. You're able to go to the game, the concert, the venue, whatever you're going to do, and understand that you are protected for this insanity that seems to be persistent in the United States. Recently, I was looking at the timing of when you and I were going to talk, and there's never a good time, but unfortunately, we're now over 600 incidents of a mass shooting in the United States this year, and we still have a month to go. Depending on what you look at, the definition of a mass shooting, in my understanding, Dr. Lankford, and correct me if I'm wrong, is 4 or more in a single incident. Is that about accurate?
Yeah. Typically, the natural question is, what's the difference between like a single shooting and at what point does it reach the threshold for mass? And yes, traditionally that's been 4 or more. And some data looks at 4 or more victims killed, and other looks at 4 or more victims shot.
Yeah. So that should shock us, but we're not tone deaf to it, I don't think. But, during the holidays, all of us were with our families. And when the Walmart shooting recently, down in Chesapeake, I believe it was, in Virginia, not far from where I was, here we go again. And yes, it was a little bit different. Yes, it was, the case could be made it was more targeted. Once the investigation unfolds, you find out all the details of what happens. But here we are again, where the general public probably has a hesitation about going into public spaces and not have to think about that. Movie theaters. I don't know about you, but when I go to a movie theater, I am not comfortable because there's only one way in and one way out generally.
Yeah, in fact, I was thinking of exactly that same thing when you're talking. It used to be you would go into a movie theater and you'd have the way you came in and the way you came out, and maybe there'd be an emergency exit door somewhere with a little lighted placard. But traditionally, it was always like, in case of fire, this is your way out, right? In terms of that emergency exit. And now I think people don't think, oh, what happens if this movie theater catches on fire? It's more like, what would I do if I'm trapped in this row, with 5 people to my left and 5 people to my right, and someone starts shooting? Because of course that's happened.
Yeah, chances are, in any movie theater I've ever been in, you're pretty much screwed if the shooter is down in the front and center by the screen, because you have to go down to that area in order to get out, be it left, right, or the emergency exits are always down. They're never behind you at the top, at least not in my experience. we'll talk a little bit later about technologies as part of the solution. For the listeners, we want to make sure that we are staying away from politics, because really this phenomenon transcends all presidencies and Congresses. So this is not something we're going to get in a ditch on, this side or that side and what's good and bad. But I think we can certainly assert that waiting on a legislative solution to curb this is going to be difficult, if not impossible. So I want to talk more about the psychology of it, Dr. Lankford. I want to talk more about some technologies, because I assume most of our listeners are on the practitioner end. They either run retail or movie theaters or public forums, and they really want to hear your insights on not only the psychology, the profile in retail. That's a dirty word, but the FBI uses profile all the time. What is the profile of an active shooter? If we read the news, it always seems to be males between 18 and 25, so younger males. I don't remember any female active shooters, Dr. Lankford. Is that of recent?
There have been a few, and then occasionally you'll have like there was a attack that the FBI classified as a active shooting that occurred in Las Vegas, where man and woman together shot some police officers, and then they went and fled into a Walmart where the violence continued. So occasionally you have men and women attacking together, but it's like 95% male or more, depending on your definition.
And what is the age range of the shooters usually?
Well, actually, there is quite a range, and again, I'm not trying to soft pedal this, but so much of it depends on exactly who you're studying. Many of the recent incidents have been committed by perpetrators who are young, 18, 19, 20, 21. But we absolutely do have shooters who are older, including like the Las Vegas shooter at the concert, the Harvest Festival, who actually has committed the deadliest mass shooting in the United States as of this time. He was the one who was firing from above on the concert goers below. And he was, he wasn't elderly, but he was, well past 50, I think, 60 or more.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of takes you back to the early days. What was that? University of Texas in the 60s when they had the shooter in the tower. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you some broad questions to kind of shape the conversation, and then we'll drill down on anything that piques interest, and I already see a couple questions I will get to here in a minute. But take us, Dr. Lankford, if you could, in the stereotypical mind of the active shooter. What, through all of your research, could be the causes is probably not the right word, but kind of what are the commonalities in all the studies that you've done that could probably put some light on, this is the average shooter. What's going on in their head?
Sure. We'll probably talk about some of the complexities a little later. So you can think about the average, but you can also think of kind of subtypes or categories. But in general, of course, one of the most obvious things is that they're almost always male, as you said. And typically we would think about that more in terms of masculinity than biology, right? But they're more often male than people who commit homicide in general, right? So it's not just saying like, well, men are more aggressive in general. It's really saying that this particular type of crime is more appealing to men and often young men. In addition to that, sometimes you hear that they're always white, and that's absolutely not the case. So that would be a misperception. If you look at the stats on race, they're about proportionate when it comes to the number of white people in the United States and the number of white people who commit mass shootings or active shootings. So, there's more white people involved in mass shootings or active shootings than some other types of crime, but not more than the proportion of the population. And then when we think about psychology, one of the studies I did was looking at really comparisons between mass shooters and active shooters and the average American, I also looked at comparisons between mass shooters and active shooters and other people who commit murder in more common ways and people who die by suicide. And one of the things that it suggests in terms of profiles is that mass shooters often have more in common with people who commit suicide than they do with your standard murderer. For example, these are often premeditated attacks, whereas homicide in general is often not premeditated. It's often a crime of passion or a crime of escalation. So for retailers, they might know that sometimes you have someone like rob a convenience store, and when that escalates to murder, often the murder is not planned. So what the data clearly shows, like if you plan to rob a store and you walk in there with a gun and things go a little wrong, it's just more likely that you end up shooting someone, even if you weren't planning on committing murder. Yeah. But these are premeditated acts of murder, often committed by people who are acting alone in 95% plus cases, which again is different from like gang violence, drug trafficking, things like that. But more common of suicide, which is almost always alone. These individuals often do have mental health problems, not always diagnosed, not always easy to kind of prove, if you will. But just one of the things I printed out here was this Walmart shooter from Chesapeake, his suicide note, and one of the things he said here was did he fail his management team and everyone that ever loved me by convincing them I was normal? So when he's saying I was convincing people that I was normal, whether or not he had a diagnosed mental illness or not, that's his way of saying that I wasn't psychologically healthy and normal. Yeah. And so that's another kind of similarity with suicide, whereas many acts of murder in general are not committed by people with serious mental health problems or who plan or expect to die. And I guess that's the last thing I would emphasize here in terms of profiles, that many times these mass shooters and active shooters plan or expect to die. Now, if we look at just kind of like the number of suicides in the United States in general and the number of people who have serious suicidal thoughts or make suicide attempts, those numbers aren't the same because they're often people who are contemplating suicide who don't go through with it. And so we see that same thing with active shooters and mass shooters, but I guess I would just point to your audience and say, like, keep in mind that just because these attackers don't always end up with a bullet in their head, doesn't mean they weren't suicidal or didn't have strong self-destructive tendencies. Sometimes they're actually expecting law enforcement to show up and that they would die by suicide by cop. And then other times, they're planning on dying. They're planning on this being their moment of glory. But then they change their mind or kind of get scared at the last moment and surrender.
You must be reading my script because I want to ask you something you just said. Is the notoriety or the martyrdom or the fame sure, you're probably going to die. I mean, if the cops don't, take you out there, then maybe you'll have a personal carry person in the Walmart store and he or she shoots you.
And Brad, if you don't mind me just adding, and best case scenario, you're facing life in prison, right? So that's kind of another way of saying you don't care about your current life as it stands. That's
right. And so, and I'm not going to use the right terms, but you're the SME, but New Zealand, for example, always, at least traditionally, has suppressed releasing the names of the offenders, not just in mass shootings, but in crimes. Of course, when I was at Walmart, our CEO, Walmart US CEO, Greg Foran, was a native Kiwi from New Zealand. And he, on the periods we had the mass shootings, he was just dumbfounded that he said, "You've got more guns in a single store than I have in my entire country." He really had a tough time getting his head around the cultural casualness, if you will, of, well, we got another mass shooting at store X, response teams on the jets, they're going over, here's what we're doing. It was like a hurricane. We prepare for all that stuff. They, not we, I don't work there anymore. But what do you think if we did something like that in the U.S. to say that we don't make public the perp's identity, and which would remove from the media's, incessant, dribbling for months after that. Well, what did the shooter have for breakfast? How was he raised? Where was he raised? What did he get in school? And it goes on and on. Do you think there's merit in that?
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. I've done a ton of research on this specific subject, and it's almost like we could spend 2 hours just talking about this one factor. So I'll try to simplify. First of all, this is learned behavior, right? These mass shooters and active shooters are learning from and copying previous attackers. And it's very different from when we think about things like stealing. In every culture in the world, there's going to be stealing. In every culture in the world, people lose their temper, right? Even animals, you see stealing, you see aggression, right? But so this is not something where it's like this type of behavior is inevitable or just pops in people's head. They're copying and learning from other individuals. And in large part, that's because of the media coverage that these individuals get, which is outrageous and outsized. So I've done studies which showed that literally the value of the free advertising that mass shooters get from the media coverage they receive is more than you would get for winning the Nobel Prize, winning a Pulitzer. And actually, it's more than top American celebrities. So, I did direct comparisons saying, like, how much did this shooter get in free media coverage the month of his attack, and how much did Tom Cruise get or Kim Kardashian get? And in many of these cases, it's literally the case that the mass shooters are getting more attention. And then just part of the problem here, then, of course, is we mentioned that there's similarities between suicide and mass shooters who are suicidal or active shooters who are suicidal. But some of these individuals are making a calculation, which is if I only take my own life and die in my apartment, no one's going to know who I am. And especially if they're young men, it's exciting for them to think, but if I go commit an attack out in public of this type where I'm killing innocent people, everyone will know who I am. And then the way we've directly seen this is things like the Buffalo shooter at the supermarket from this year, live streaming his attack, right? So that's just kind of the next manifestation of this. Perpetrators getting attention from the media and then trying to get it themselves on social media. But I guess I would just point to, like, how do I know that he live streamed it? It's not because I saw it. It's because every major media outlet talked about it, right? So ultimately, like, sometimes the media tries to say, oh, well, these people would be known even if we didn't give them outrageous amounts of coverage. And I think that's really passing the buck on their part.
Yeah, I think, my thought with that really started with terrorism. So Timothy McVeigh, for example, April 19th, 1995, I think that was, an act of domestic terrorism. What would have happened had Timothy McVeigh and the other compatriots he had with him, had that not been made the media? That, obviously the event happened, 168, I believe, people died. A tragedy, here's what we're doing. Because with the media's narrative, it almost seems the shift of importance goes from those victims to the perpetrator. And, in a conscious adult mind, that is grossly unfair. We get the thoughts and prayers and that kind of stuff for the victims, but then we talk about the shooter, in this case, the shooter, for months sometimes, depending on the complexity. So if that were not part of the equation, I feel that, that would probably, it may impact just what you just said. Well, if I'm not going to get any notoriety, it's only going to be on social media, and I'd have to go to Facebook before I go to the Target store to do it and get it out, and it'll become viral once I do it, but it won't be amplified through national media channels.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said a ton of things that are right on there, and I think your reference of the Oklahoma city bombing is spot on. What I was thinking of even before that, the Munich Olympics, when there was a hostage taking there, the hostage takers from Palestine specifically said, you offered us an international showcase, right? They knew that by attacking there, that their act of terrorism would generate more attention for themselves and their cause than anything they could do in any other way. And so with the media coverage of these perpetrators, I guess you see a couple things. One is you see that people who want attention are incentivized to commit mass shootings. But then separate from that, you also see that they're incentivized to kill large numbers of victims because they know that the more victims they kill, the more fame and attention they'll get. And then beyond that, you have these things like copycat effects or contagion effects where, and the Walmart shooting in Chesapeake was closely clustered chronologically right within a short amount of time with another incident. So one of the things researchers kind of try to look at is the contagion effect, right? Contagion is a metaphor, but you can actually trace in some cases mass shooters who have admitted, or we see based on their online search history, that they've been searching and studying previous mass shooters.
Yeah, the Oklahoma City deal, and I'm of an age where, I was in college down there on campus in the building you're probably sitting in the very early 80s. And it was right about the time, I can't remember the specific date, but really in my lifetime, the beginning of the active shooter or even that behavior was in the Postal Service. And that's where the term was coined, going postal. And I can't remember when in the 80s that was, but I went on active duty in January of 84. So I was really out of the civilian network. And thank God we didn't have social media back then. So if you didn't pick up a newspaper and read it, you didn't know it, or watch the 6 o'clock news. But really does it go back farther than that? Or was that really in your mind kind of the first time we really had a mass shooting?
Right. Well, there are different stages. I think there was a notorious, I believe it was 1986, Edmonds post office shooting, which is associated with that phrase, going postal, as you said. But you also referenced there was the 1966 shooting at the University of Texas, the tower shooting. Yep. That's often pointed to as kind of as a inflection point in terms of the amount of attention. Actually, that attack got media coverage that was essentially simultaneous that day. It was very different from the media today, but that was kind of a game changer. But then there have been other things along those lines where there was Columbine, obviously generated a tremendous amount of attention. And then we've had other things, Sandy Hook and other attacks since then. But if you don't mind me mentioning, school shootings have gotten a lot of attention, in particular, as I said, University of Texas, you have Columbine, you have Virginia Tech, you have Sandy Hook and things like that. But some of the data I looked up just to check for you and your audience is that according to the FBI, the most common incident location type for active shootings is not school shootings. It's actually businesses that are open to pedestrian traffic. So you can talk about kind of different types of incidents, right, which generate different types of attention. And there's no doubt that some of the deadliest mass shootings have occurred at places like Sandy Hook, Parkland, and Uvalde. But if you just think about the frequency of incidents, the FBI is saying businesses that are open to pedestrian traffic are the most common targeted location.
So that would be, for instance, in a retail perspective, probably retail establishments on a bus route or walking distance in a metro area or something like that, not out in the middle of the wilderness stores that would be more prone for that to occur.
Yeah, and I think they're also kind of pointing out the distinction between, if you have a private law firm, for example, you're not having people walk through that law firm, right? But you have other businesses like movie theaters, like grocery stores, there was a shooting in Atlanta at these spas in 2021. So you have a variety of places which basically say our business model is to let strangers in through the door, and that's one of the places where these incidents are occurring most frequently.
Got it. I'm looking at a message I should have seen earlier. Apparently, I skipped in the intro. That for our listeners, if you have a question, I've already got one. Just click on the Q&A button, and when we get to an appropriate spot to run those, we will address those. So here we are. We've stated it's a problem. Obviously, we have over 600 a year this year so far, 4 or more. You've given us some really good data points, because if I'm a retailer and I'm listening to this, I'm trying to extract every trend, every indicator I can out of this. Not that it's going to help me make better decisions on my mitigating efforts. There are technologies that are out there today that can help detect these behaviors, and there are a couple different kinds. So you have advanced warning systems, a company called Zero Eyes up in the Northeast in Pennsylvania, and they are the early warning, one of the early warning providers that can detect through an existing camera system upwards of 150 feet range, which is precious time, because if you think about, what was it, 2019, the mass shooting in El Paso Walmart, that person dwelled in the parking lot under clear view of existing cameras for a period of time that could, I want to emphasize that for any listeners, could have provided precious reactionary behaviors, protocols to be implemented, possibly lock down the store, etc. So it certainly could have helped make a more positive difference. But they're in the early warning space. You have a couple other ShotSpotter. Those are acoustic. So depending on where you are, so if I am in downtown Metro New York, or say Bentonville, Arkansas, and not every corner of the city is covered with a camera, it's not going to do me a whole lot of good except with an acoustic shot warning. So if I hear that and it cues on the transmitter and alerts the police within seconds, not waiting on a 911 call, they can respond to that. Amber Box is another one. So there are technologies out there. And one thing I want to share from the retail perspective, Dr. Lankford, you may be thinking, okay, if there are technologies out there, why are they not everywhere on every existing camera system? And, I liken the analysis sometimes to that of the early days in the 70s in the American auto manufacturing, that it was a simple math problem. Before we do a recall that's going to cost me $100 million, if I lose a couple of lawsuits because of product, malfunction, if you will, and that costs me $10 million, it's cheaper for me to pay the lawsuits than it is to do the recall. And I'm not saying that's the logic, broad logic in retail, but it's part of some of the explanation of, if we have these technologies out there, they're immediately scalable. It's a software solution, so it's not like having to go to 800 stores and drill in different hardware and equipment. Why wouldn't you have that? Because clearly the active shooter phenomenon is not going to go away in the United States. If anything, it's going to be worse. More and more people are open carry. More and more people feel the need to walk into Target stores, for example, with an AK-47 over their back just to make a statement, because they can. So it's concerning that the technologies are out there, but they are not more widely adopted across the board. I'll give you a brief reference, and then we'll take this question in the queue. But when I was in Afghanistan, and any veteran that's listening will understand exactly what I'm saying, you got really used to weapons being everywhere, obviously. And specifically in Afghanistan, everybody has an AK-47. Doesn't mean you're military, doesn't mean you're special force, it doesn't mean anything other than you can. And the difficulty was that in understanding who the bad guys were. And I was at a conference in Kabul. This was 2003. And clearly there were some American, I don't know what they were, Secret Service, FBI, CIA, who knows? They never would come clean who they were. But they were well armed. So I leaned over to ask him when participants were coming in the door. I said, hey, nothing for nothing, but how do you know who the bad guys are? Because every car that pulled up out front was a Toyota 4Runner pickup. A bunch of locals got out of the back. Every one of them had an AK-47. Every one of them had some kind of a military uniform on. You didn't know who was who. Like, are those guys getting ready to come in and take the place down, or are they that governor's security detail, as rough as they look? And he looked at me and said, we have no idea. If you hear one shot, we're all dead because we're all going to shoot each other. The whole place will be dead. So let me connect that to the environment in America, that even today, when I go in any store, any Starbucks, anything, and I see somebody dressed like you with a 9mm or whatever on their hip, and I don't see a badge, you do a double take on that. And it's an unfortunate place we're in, but I think, again, back to my earlier comment, we've gotten to the, not complacency, but we've become tone deaf to what has incrementally happened since, the 1960s that you mentioned. Let me ask, let's go to one of the questions. Okay, with a limited budget, this is coming from a retailer, and typically, Dr. Lankford, I don't mention the names, so we'll keep it anonymous as we go, but I know this guy, and he's a leader at a leading retailer. With a limited budget, where would you advise companies to spend their resources? Pre-event identification or event training for store teams. Where would you spend your money if you had a finite amount of money, which all retailers do?
Yeah. So I'm happy to answer this question. I hope it won't be used to paint me as callous. But as you said, sometimes there are kind of cold calculations that are being made here, right? Okay, so the solution essentially for a lot of these challenges or the recommendations, they really vary for like what should society do versus what should you as an individual retailer do, right? And one of the concepts there that matters is referred to as displacement. So what is our goal? Is our goal to stop this individual from attacking at all? Or in a more callous way, is it to say, the most important thing to me as a retailer is that he doesn't attack at my location, right? And so if he goes and attacks somewhere else instead, nobody wants that to happen, but is that a meaningful accomplishment? And so, I guess if I was a retailer, I might come to the conclusion that if that mass shooting occurs or that active shooting occurs, I don't want it to be at my location. So that being said, you can start to think about deterrence a little bit. So there absolutely have been mass shooters and active shooters who pick their location in part based on their perceptions of whether there was armed security there. Now, that might seem a little counterintuitive because we said that some of these individuals, in fact, many of them are suicidal or planning to die. And yet, in many cases, they're also, they don't want to be shot the moment they walk in the door and open fire, right? They want to, in a perverse way, accomplish something. And they often would view armed security or a strong security presence as a threat. They might be throwing away their lives, essentially, as a mass shooter to accomplish nothing. And that's something they don't want. So, and then just, if we add this to get to the audience member's question, you can talk about mitigating the amount of victims who are killed if an active shooting occurs. And of course, that's important. And that's something that universities too have to think about, of course. But, and this is where, please don't, misinterpret what I'm saying. if a mass shooting occurs at your store and 3 people are killed, and a mass shooting occurs at your store and 5 people are killed, if you said, well, we did a tremendous job in making sure that only 3 people were killed, I don't think you're going to go to sleep that night saying we did enough, or that you're happy with the outcome, right? So look, I appreciate anything that can be done to save lives, but if I were a retailer, I would say I don't want this shooting occurring at my store, and so preventing that person from coming in the door, either by deterring that person with a security presence, or as Brand, you mentioned, having a technology or having some sort of surveillance that makes it possible that I can lock those doors before the person even walks in. I think those would be kind of my priorities, rather than saying, if a shooting occurs, we want to do what we can so that we stop this person as quickly as possible. That's important, but that's really, really difficult, as we've seen in places like Uvalde. It's like in the Uvalde, you had dozens of law enforcement officers, and once that shooting starts, it's just hard to, put the toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak. So I guess that's one way of thinking about it. And then the other thing that Brandon and I had briefly discussed prior to our conversation today is preventing insider attacks, right? So the Chesapeake shooting was committed by an insider. Another example was 2017, I think it's Eaton Weiss Market shooting in Pennsylvania. Someone who worked there, I believe, came in and shot multiple coworkers. So I would think about, how do I discourage or deter people from targeting my location? And how do I make sure that my employees will not be the problem, in terms of being really cognizant to warning signs, risk factors, threats they might make. Sometimes these threats are made in jest, but they're not joking, right? They're floating the idea. They're saying, like, and in the Chesapeake shooting, I think people who survived have come forward and said, this individual already made threats. He said, like, if I get fired, like, something bad's going to happen. And people really need to take that seriously, who are your employees, and report that, to do whatever we can to prevent the day where the person even shows up with a gun.
Yeah, I can, obviously I've been retired from there for 6 years now almost, so I certainly don't have any firsthand knowledge, but I can only imagine the reviews and the investigations going on to figure out how, just like the FBI would, when you have a red flag, had there been a red flag law, and how did we miss this? I mean, how many times do we hear of a crime that happens? It's like, how in the world did we miss this? And, that's where your head always goes, and there are professionals like this next question that's come in. I know this gentleman, a career federal in this space, but I can only imagine, everything they're having to go through to figure out, what did we miss and how could this have been prevented? Because this was not really just a broad mass shooting coming like the top supermarket that you mentioned, where you come in with an AK and just start randomly killing people because they're black in that specific case. So this question, do you have suggestions regarding the establishment of a threat management process in retail? And I think you answered a little bit of that just now. Is there now a standard of care?
Yeah, so my understanding of this question, if you're talking about threat management process, you're probably talking about for employees who might be at risk, right? Of doing something terrible. And yes, I do think that's absolutely important. One of the things I would really call attention to is a lot of these individuals who commit these shootings do not have a serious criminal record. And that's one of the mistakes we see made again and again, where someone says, this person's been making threats, for example. Let's look and let's just check. Does he have a violent criminal record? No. Okay, then we're good. That's a false sense of security that people get because they think, of course, past behavior is a good predictor of future behavior. And sometimes that's true, but we need to be looking at the right types of behavior and not just violent actions. So, as I mentioned before, threat assessment should include looking at does this individual show signs of suicidal tendencies? Has this person been making threats? Does this person meet the general profile? Again, I'm not going to say that you can't have a female shooter in her 60s, but if you're playing the numbers, I would be more concerned, all things being equal, by threats made by a male in his late teens or early 20s. And then I guess some of the other things to look at are, does this person seem to be kind of unhealthily obsessed or interested in previous mass shootings? So we really have seen these glaring red flags where someone, coworkers report, oh, so-and-so always seemed to be interested in mass violence in like a peculiar way, and we just always thought it was weird. Well, it's more than weird, it's concerning. But then let me add here, we also have just like other basic things you can look at, like a high percentage of these people are not only male, but they're single and childless, right? So they're socially isolated, right? And so I guess again, I would just point out, like, there are established threat assessment tools you can use, and that's definitely worth looking into when it comes to insider attacks. But ultimately, if someone says something that's a little concerning, and you have a good reason to think this person has something to live for, they're probably not going to be a problem of this type. It's the person who's given up on life who I'd be worried about, because kind of as we said earlier on, you're either going to end up dead or you're end up facing life in prison. This crime differs from almost all other crimes in the United States in that way. So let me just mention, like, bank robbers. Bank robbery is a highly risky behavior. You're far more likely to get away with bank robbery than you are to commit an active shooting and then walk away without facing the consequences. So these really are crimes committed by people who have given up on their life permanently.
So would you say then that there is a correlation of suicidal tendency in an active shooter?
Oh, absolutely. Again, researchers like to sometimes debate, how we measure these things, right? Because sometimes we have, they wrote a manifesto and they admitted it, and other times we have other types of evidence, right? But yes, there's no doubt that they're often suicidal, and frankly, you want to, like, if you're doing something to take care of your employees, like, you don't want them just dying by suicide either, right? So if you're taking care of them in these ways, that can have the benefit of also preventing mass shootings and active shootings. Let me just add one other thing. As a professor, I have to think about insider attacks too, right? Committed by students. Yep. And one of the things that, as department chair, I try to emphasize is treating people with respect. And again, I mentioned the concept of displacement, meaning we have people who get failing grades, right? And I'm sure employers have people who get bad evaluations. That doesn't have to be a personal attack. It can be presented in an objective and even caring, if you will, way, saying, I respect you as a person, but there's been a problem with your performance, right? And the reason I mention that is because many mass shooters and active shooters, including this Chesapeake shooter, have some sort of grievance. They feel, and this interacts with masculinity, they feel that they've been diminished or discriminated against or humiliated in some profound way that is a wound to their self kind of status. And so that's one of the reasons why committing these attacks and getting fame and attention is so appealing to them.
Yeah, I think so. To distill that, it's the gentleman was asking about the threat management process, formalized threat management process. Is that now going to become an expectation of standard of care? So if I'm a retailer or a movie theater or whatever, that I have to have a formalized threat management process to include what you just spoke of, that you have, like TSA started after 9/11, see something, say something. It's like, we don't care what it is. If you see a backpack in the airport, nobody's around it, you need to report that. So it becomes a heightened awareness of the environment in which you're in, that if, like you just explained to us so well, that, if somebody doesn't have anything to live for, they don't have any kids, they're not doing well on evals, if you start piecing that together, it doesn't take a PhD in psychology to figure out there might be something behind the curtain. And coupled with, they're often talking about the mass shooting incidents or a fascination with guns. Not that that's unique anymore, but going to the range all the time. And that's what I do on my off time, because I now have a sniper rifle, or I now have this. It becomes, I think now that it appears that becomes an expectation of a public entity, certainly at the scale of Walmart, Target, Walgreens, CVS, Kroger, the bigger retailers, that would be a basic expectation. Because as you know, Dr. Lankford, every time something like this happens, the incident in isolation is enormously catastrophic for human life, but the monetary toll is also catastrophic. That you begin to understand that, these things have gotten to the point where they can put some entities out of business through the litigation that comes afterward. So I gotta think that at some point there's going to be a basis of process in retail, that when these things do happen and the lawyers figured out you didn't have a plan, that becomes a lot more expensive. Got another hint here. So we've got 8 more minutes left. And I had a few questions I wanted to ask through, and one that is more along the psychology line is social media and the toxicity and how that amplifies mental health challenges in the world, or in the space today. We'd need another hour to go through that, because that is one of my affinities that I'm keenly interested in. I talked about that a lot in a book that, back in, I don't know how old you are, Dr. Lankford, but back in my day, you went to the grocery store with your parents and you saw the tabloid on the checkout while your mom was throwing all the groceries on the belt, and you looked at it and it had clearly insane things on it, human babies with 3 eyes or half monkey or whatever. But even at a young age as a kid, I knew it was trash, but it was in isolation. It was in that moment I was there, and then you moved on, the groceries are bagged, and you're back to, playing cowboys and Indians or whatever in the yard. That's different today. It is pervasive. It's constantly in our faces, and we really struggle as a society around the world in understanding information from disinformation. I would love to do another segment on that, but we're kind of bumping up on the rail. Let me, a couple of things. One I wanted to get your thoughts on, Dr. Lankford, is why does this appear, your best judgment, why does this appear to be a uniquely American challenge?
Well, so there certainly are cultural issues, and they're difficult to measure, right? So, for example, just at a baseline, the number, you talked about kind of when you were growing up and then when I was growing up. Well, in recent decades, we've seen a major increase and it's related to social media, people who want to be famous, especially for young people. It's now replaced wealth, for many of them, as the number one standard for success. In other words, rather than be rich, I really want to be famous. So that's a big problem when it comes to these types of attacks. But then also, just in terms of the firearm issues, the Chesapeake shooter, he purchased his firearm on Tuesday, just like the 22nd, I believe it was, of November. So this is someone who was giving off these red flags and warning signs and then was able to purchase the firearm. And so one of the problems we have is not necessarily the number of guns in the country, but the easy access for people who've already shown themselves to be dangerous.
Okay. Yeah, I have some friends, overseas that have security responsibility for shopping malls and public forums, and it's not something you laugh at, but it certainly comes up that and I'll just say it, you Americans are crazy. We'll have one in Germany or the Netherlands, and that's it. You guys have so many, you can't tell me now how many you've had. We've lost count. So,
I was just going to add to that. And in fact, even some of the times when they happen in Europe or other countries, sometimes they're copying American mass shooters.
Sure they are. It's very different. One more quick question. Do you foresee any government regulations coming into play with regards to mandatory proactive measures for retail to help bend the needle on the active shooters, given that the active shooter threat is becoming more and more frequent? We've already stated that. It isn't going away. But do you see the government stepping in with mandating proactive measures for retail, or is it going to be wrapped around gun laws that have, really not materialized much in depth?
Right. I think it's a great question. There would be an easy argument for it. All you'd have to do is look at the FBI data and say the most common location is these businesses that are open to members of the public. But no, I don't think so. In other words, there are a lot of things they could do, right? Government regulations, you would think they would apply them to schools, perhaps. You would think they could apply them to the media coverage of mass shooters. They could apply some to gun sellers in terms of screening. I really think, don't wait for the government to force your hand on this. As a retailer, you better decide what's best for you, and you better have kind of the courage of your convictions to do what's right, because I don't expect it to be mandated.
Yeah, I'm with you. Unfortunately, politics aside, I just think that these things continue to happen, and I probably ought to pause right there. They keep happening, and very little meaningful legislation comes about that could mandate that for all schools in the public school system. Would have to have a technology X and give you a menu of three technologies that have to be in place, just like having fire alarms, just like having emergency exits, just like having handicap access, all of those sorts of things. I see that in that same space. But unfortunately, we're a bit lethargic in that. Let me do a couple of closing housekeeping notes. First of all, Dr. Lankford, this is awesome. I have been looking forward to this since you and I talked on campus, whenever that was, a few months ago. If you ask every top retailer what is on the top of their mind, the tier ones, the big guys, it's safety. And that includes associates or employees and the general public. If you'd asked that question before COVID, you would have gotten a different answer. But it's very much top of mind.